So the Bible is made up of 66 books, split into two parts, the Old Testament and the New Testament. These individual 66 books were written by 44 plus different authors from different places around the world, written in 3 different languages over the span of thousands and thousands of years. So it makes sense that when we pick up the Bible and flip it open, we can sometimes feel a bit lost, like we don't even know what's going on. And that's not an uncommon thing. In fact, I did some research a few years ago about what are some of the reasons that youth struggle to read the Bible, and one of the main things that came up was not knowing what was going on when they did read it. So here's a series for you to help you to generally know what's going on when you read the Bible. So one thing that's important to realise is that the Bible isn't directly written to us today. Now what I mean by that is, like, it's not like the individual authors of these books of the Bible wrote them for people in England to read up to 6,000 years later. So the Bible is not written as an instruction manual for us today, or it's not a textbook about God, or it's not a bunch of inspirational quotes or stories that we can just pull out and apply to our lives. No, the authors of the individual books of the Bible wrote them to make sense to the people they were writing to address the problems which were going on in that day. So that book of the Bible is addressed to ancient Israelites to teach them how to live in Israel. This book of the Bible is written thousands of years later to new Christians in the ancient city of Corinth to tackle problems specific to them. So of course, if we try and read the Bible like it's written to us as a list of basic instructions or a textbook or a grab bag of quotes, we're not going to fully understand what's going on. We need to read the Bible as it was intended to be read first, in order to see how it can apply to us and how God can speak to us through it. So how do we do that? Well, we have to see the Bible as one long, unified narrative, a story from beginning to end, told through different types of literature, authors, books, all pointing to Jesus. So this is where we're going to start now, with an overview of this story told throughout the Bible. And we'll start with the Old Testament now, and we'll do the New Testament next video. Now this is important to know, this story, because when you open the Bible, wherever you're reading, you'll be able to read it and see it as placed as part of this overall story that leads to Jesus, and that helps us to understand it. So let's have a look. So this narrative starts from God creating the world and humans, and although God made the world to be good, humans gave into a thing called sin, and this changed everything. This sin is something that affected every human heart and the entire world. It means that we naturally push away from God and we decide that we don't need Him in our lives, even though He's reaching out to us. Sin literally becomes a barrier between us and Him that we can't knock down ourselves. So from this point, God sees that we aren't able to conquer this sin, and so He decides that He's going to take it upon Himself to restore the world and free humans of this sin. And He chooses one family to work through. This family would grow and become a great nation called the Israelites, and through this family, God was going to bring the Messiah, the one who was going to end sin once and for all. Spoiler alert, that's Jesus. So the Old Testament follows this family through a mix of different situations, told through different types of writing like history, letters and poetry, all the way up until Jesus. So this family go from wandering around in the wilderness to a while, to being slaves in Egypt for 400 years, to wandering around again for a long time, to finally having a homeland called Israel. Now throughout this time, God establishes different promises to the Israelites that will help get these people to the place they need to be for Jesus to join the party. And in return, these Israelites promised to stay close and faithful to God. Now, if you've read the Old Testament, you'll know that these people were not very good at staying close to God. This sin was still just as much a part of their lives. Now, throughout the years, they would continuously push away from and reject God, and then get into a tricky situation because of that, with their attack, taken prisoner or anything, and then they would come back to God, at which point He would get them out of that situation. Now, over and over again this would happen. They would reject Him, but He would be faithful and restore them, and then they'd do it again. Now, a real high point was when King David came around. He loved God, he united Israel, and he led Israel generally towards God. And people thought that he might be the Messiah, he was the one. But in the end, he was just as broken as everyone else. Now, from this point, there was a general downward spiral as the Israelites and their kings came further and further away from God. So God would send his prophets, people like Isaiah, Jeremiah, Elijah, Ezekiel, to try and challenge Israel and lead them back to God. But ultimately they didn't listen, as eventually the people of Israel were attacked and taken away from their homeland. They were exiled in Babylon as prisoners and slaves. But God was still moving, and even in this tricky situation, he showed that he still cared for his people, even though they continuously walked away from him. And eventually, he led his people to freedom, back to their homeland, and he rebuilt Israel. And from here, Israel generally did better at staying faithful to God, but they still had this underlying sin problem. And then there was silence for 400 years as they waited. And then, as if the world was holding its breath, Jesus was born. And then that brings us to the New Testament, but we'll get to that in the next video. So that's the general story of the Old Testament. Like I said, it's told through different ways and in different types of writing and sometimes in different orders. But everything you read in the Old Testament is part of that story of getting to Jesus. Whether it's reading about ancient battles that seem pretty brutal, or it's God rebuking Israel for rejecting him again, or reading the poems of particular people who are part of this journey, it all has a place in this story of God bringing a saviour to end sin once and for all. I'll see you next time.